At 2:15 on August 7, 1944, Sergeant Robert Callahan crouched behind the steel shield of his 3-inch M5 gun just east of Mortain, France, listening to something enormous moving through the fog. He could not see it, but he could hear it. Heavy engines, metal tracks grinding against pavement. The deep, unmistakable growl of German Panther tanks. Callahan was 26 years old. He had served 11 months with the 823rd Tank Destroyer Battalion. He had trained to fight tanks in open country, under clear skies, with targets visible through his gun sight. He had never trained to fight blind. Yet somewhere ahead of him, hidden inside a wall of gray, nearly 200 German tanks were advancing toward 12 American guns that could not retreat. Company A of the 823rd had arrived at Mortain only 3 days earlier alongside the 30th Infantry Division. Their weapons were towed 3-inch M5 anti-tank guns, 3 tons of steel designed to destroy enemy armor at ranges up to 2,100 yards. But those numbers meant nothing if you could not see your target. And on this morning, visibility was barely 15 feet. The fog had rolled in after midnight. Thick summer ground fog that swallowed the Norman countryside whole. Roads vanished. Fields vanished. Even the nearest hedgerows dissolved into gray silence. Callahan's crew had dug their gun into position facing the eastern approach to town. They had shoveled earth into protective berms, camouflaged the gun trails, stacked armor-piercing shells in neat rows beside the breach. Now they waited in conditions that made aiming impossible. 3 weeks earlier, the battalion had fought at St. Lo. They had watched German armor appear suddenly through hedgerows, overrunning gun crews before they could even fire a second shot. Towed guns had one fatal weakness. They could not move under fire. Once in placed, you stayed, or you died. The night before, battalion intelligence had warned them. German armor was massing east of Mortain. For divisions, the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandard Adolf Hitler, the 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich, the 2nd Panzer Division, the 116th Panzer Division. This was Operation Luttich, Hitler's counteroffensive. His last attempt to cut through American lines, reach the coast at Avranches, and split the Allied invasion in two. The 30th Infantry Division held a front 20 miles wide. The 823rd Tank Destroyer Battalion had only 12 guns to support them. 12 guns against 200 German tanks. Callahan had spent the night doing the math in his head. His M5 gun could penetrate a Panther side armor at 1,500 yards. Maybe the frontal armor at closer range if he got lucky. But all of that assumed one thing: that he could see the target. He could not. At 2:43, the first German tank fired. Callahan saw the muzzle flash bloom orange inside the fog, 200 yards ahead. A sudden burst of light, like lightning trapped in smoke. The shell screamed overhead and detonated somewhere behind his position. Another flash followed. Another tank firing blind. Callahan understood instantly. If he could see their flashes, they could see his. The first crew to fire would reveal themselves and die. He had seconds to decide. Stay silent and be overrun, or fire blind and gamble everything. He gave the order with a hand signal. His gunner traversed toward where the flash had appeared. The loader slammed a high explosive shell into the breach. There was no time to switch to armor piercing. Fire now, or never fire at all. The gun roared at 2:45. The recoil slammed backward, driving the gun trails deep into the earth. For 3 seconds, Callahan's own muzzle flash lit the fog like a signal flare. Every German tank within a mile could now see him. He waited. 5 seconds. 10. 15. Then an explosion erupted ahead. A deep, violent detonation followed by smaller secondary blasts. A tank burning. They had hit something. They had fired blind and killed a Panther. But now the Germans knew where they were. Callahan shouted the next order. Move the gun. 5 men grabbed steel trails and dragged 3 tons of metal 30 feet north. Muscle screamed. Boots slipped in wet earth. They shoved the gun into its new position and loaded armor-piercing rounds. 40 seconds later, German shells slammed into their previous location. 3 direct hits. The fog had saved them. The Germans were firing at memory. Callahan waited for the next flash. It came seconds later. Another orange bloom in the fog. Fire. The M5 recoiled again. Another explosion followed. Another Panther burning. The tactic was clear now. Fire at their flashes. Move before they fired back. Repeat. It was madness. It was improvisation. It was survival. All along the American line, other guns began firing. Orange bursts lit the fog. German shells answered. The battle became invisible violence guided only by light and sound. At 3 o'clock, a gun 200 yards south took a direct hit. Callahan heard the impact. Then the ammunition exploding. Then nothing. One gun gone. 5 men dead. The German tanks stopped advancing. Their engines idled. They maneuvered blindly, searching for targets they could not see. Callahan's crew stood exposed in open earth, protected only by a thin shield of steel that meant nothing against tank guns. Another American gun fired. Another flash. Another explosion. Each burst of light revealed death. Each second revealed position. At 3:20, Callahan saw shapes moving in the fog. Infantry. German Panzer Grenadiers advancing on foot. They were hunting the guns. His ammunition handler held a Thompson submachine gun. Their only defense against infantry. But firing it would reveal their position. Callahan waited. 50 feet. 40. 30. 20. At 10 feet, he made his decision. The Thompson erupted. 3-round bursts. 5 German soldiers dropped instantly. The survivors scattered into the fog. But the damage was done. Every German tank within range now knew where Callahan was. He ordered immediate displacement. The crew dragged the gun 40 yards northwest. Seconds later, German shells obliterated their previous position. By 4 o'clock, Company A had lost 5 guns, nearly half its strength, but they had destroyed 9 German tanks. The math favored them, for now, but the Germans had more tanks. Far more. And dawn was still hours away. The fog began to thin, not enough to see clearly, just enough to make survival harder. Because soon, the Germans would see them too. By 4:15, the fog had thinned just enough to make everything more dangerous. The German tanks were moving again. Before, they had fired blind, guessing at flashes in the gray. Now they could maneuver with purpose. Shapes began to emerge, dark silhouettes of steel advancing through fields and hedgerows. Callahan heard another sound behind him. American engines. Higher pitched. Familiar. Shermans. The 743rd Tank Battalion was arriving from the west, rushing forward to reinforce the collapsing line. For a moment, Callahan felt relief. It didn't last long. Shermans against Panthers in fog wasn't a fair fight. It was arithmetic, and the numbers favored the Germans. The Sherman's 75mm gun could rarely penetrate a Panther's frontal armor. But the Panther's long 75mm cannon could destroy a Sherman from almost any angle, often before the American crew even realized they were under threat. The radio crackled beside him. Battalion headquarters. All surviving guns were ordered to hold position. No retreat. No displacement. The infantry of the 30th Division was falling back to secondary defensive lines. Company A's guns had to remain in place and cover their withdrawal. They were now a rear guard. A sacrificial shield. Callahan checked their ammunition. 47 rounds remaining. Mixed armor piercing and high explosive. At their current rate of fire, maybe 90 minutes of combat left. Dawn would come at 6 o'clock. If they could survive until daylight, American fighter bombers might intervene. Thunderbolts. Typhoons. Air power that could turn tanks into burning wreckage. But that was still 2 hours away. At 4:30, another American gun was destroyed. Callahan saw the flash through the thinning fog. He heard the explosion. Another crew gone. 6 guns left. The Germans were advancing methodically now, eliminating each American position one at a time. It was only a matter of time. At 4:45, Callahan saw what he had feared most. A Panther tank appeared through the fog directly ahead. 300 yards. Hull down behind a hedgerow. Turret moving slowly, searching. The German commander hadn't seen them yet. But he would. Callahan's gunner was already tracking the target. Armor-piercing round loaded. They would get 1 shot. Maybe 2. No more. The Panther's turret stopped moving. It was pointing directly at them. The German gunner had seen something. Callahan gave the order. Both guns fired at 4:47. 2 shells crossed invisibly in the fog. The German shell struck the ground 6 feet in front of Callahan's gun. It ricocheted upward, screaming over their heads before detonating behind them. Callahan's armor-piercing shell struck the Panther's mantlet. Penetration. The tank froze. Smoke poured from the commander's hatch. The turret stopped moving. The crew inside was dead. Callahan exhaled slowly. 10 tanks destroyed. 6 guns left. The odds were still impossible. By 5 o'clock, visibility had improved to nearly 200 yards. That small change shifted everything. The Germans no longer needed muzzle flashes to find targets. They could see, and when tanks could see, towed guns died. South of his position, Callahan heard Sherman tanks fighting. The sharp crack of American guns. Then explosions. One Sherman burned. Then another. Panthers were killing them before the Shermans could close the distance. The radio crackled again at 5:15. Company A had destroyed 8 tanks. Company B had destroyed 3 more. 4 Shermans were lost. 2 damaged. The German advance had slowed, but not stopped. Callahan checked their remaining ammunition. 21 armor-piercing shells. No high explosive left. Every shot had to kill. At 5:30, American artillery joined the fight. 105 mm howitzers screamed overhead and exploded among the German formations. The shells couldn't penetrate Panther armor, but they suppressed infantry and forced tank crews to close their hatches, blinding them temporarily. Callahan used the opportunity. His crew dragged the gun 50 yards east, positioning it behind a stone wall for protection. They were running out of ground. The enemy was too close now. At 5:40, another American gun position was overrun. Callahan saw German infantry swarm it. The crew fought back. For 90 seconds. Then silence. 5 guns left. The sky began to lighten. Shapes became clearer. Callahan saw them fully now. German armor stretched across half a mile of countryside. 30 Panthers and Panzer IVs in view. More behind them. An entire armored column. 5 American guns. 30 German tanks. No retreat. No escape. At 5:55, Callahan saw movement to his north. 3 Panthers advancing along the hedgerow. Flanking maneuver. Professional. These were SS troops, Das Reich Division. Veterans of years of war. His crew had 3 options. Engage the flanking tanks and expose themselves. Ignore them and be destroyed from the side. Or abandon the gun. Callahan did none of those things. Because at 6 o'clock, everything changed. The fog lifted completely, and Callahan realized the truth. The tanks he had been fighting all night were not the main attack. They were a diversion. The real German breakthrough had already occurred 2 miles south. This force had been a screening element, meant to delay American defenses and pin units like his in place. And it had worked. But Callahan's guns had delayed them in return. For 4 hours, 5 American guns had held 30 German tanks in place. For hours the Germans could never recover. At 6:05, radio traffic confirmed it. American forces still held Hill 314. As long as artillery observers controlled that high ground, German tanks moving toward Avranches could be destroyed by artillery. The breakthrough was incomplete. The German tanks began pulling back at 6:15. Not fleeing. Repositioning. Both sides had done their job. Callahan looked around. 5 guns remained. 30 men gone. Dead. Wounded. Missing. For that price, they had destroyed 11 German tanks. Damaged 6 more. But more importantly, they had bought time. At 6:20, the sky filled with new sound. Aircraft. P-47 Thunderbolts. They roared in low over the battlefield. American fighter bombers. They attacked immediately. Rockets streaked toward German armor. Bombs exploded among retreating tanks. One Panther took a direct hit. Its turret lifted into the air before crashing back down. The battlefield that had been ruled by tanks for hours was now ruled by aircraft. And the German offensive was beginning to collapse. Callahan and his crew stood beside their battered gun and watched. They were still alive. And they had held. The second Thunderbolt came in low. Too low. Its bomb released just seconds before impact, detonating 5 yards short of the German tank. The explosion didn't hit the Panther directly, but it didn't need to. The concussion lifted the 45-ton machine off the ground and flipped it onto its side like a child's toy. Steel screamed. Tracks spun uselessly in the air. Inside, the crew had no chance. That was the moment the German withdrawal became something else. It became a rout. Panthers and Panzer IVs broke formation, abandoning carefully prepared positions and accelerating east, back toward their own lines. Engines roared. Tracks tore at the earth. Commanders abandoned coordination in favor of survival. Some escaped. Most didn't. The Thunderbolts hunted them relentlessly across the Norman countryside, circling overhead like predators. Rockets slammed into fleeing tanks. Machine gun fire stitched across engine decks. Bombs detonated among retreating columns. The battlefield that had belonged to German armor just hours earlier now belonged to American air power. By 8 o'clock, the ground in front of Callahan's gun told the story clearly. 17 German tanks destroyed. 11 by Company A's guns. 6 by aircraft. Battalion headquarters issued orders at 8:30. Hold position. No pursuit. No advance. The Germans still held Mortain itself. Hill 314 remained surrounded but unconquered. The battle was not finished. It had simply changed form. Callahan's crew spent the next hour moving across the battlefield, recovering what they could. 3 M5 guns were salvageable, damaged but reparable. Ammunition lay scattered across the fields. And bodies. American, German. The fog that had hidden everything during the night had lifted, revealing the full cost of survival. At 9 o'clock, Lieutenant Colonel Stanley Dieters arrived. The battalion commander walked silently along the shattered gun line. He counted the survivors. He counted the wreckage. He said nothing. He didn't need to. The battlefield spoke clearly enough. By 9:30, the larger picture was becoming clear. The German breakthrough had failed. They had not reached Avranches. They had not severed American supply lines. Hill 314 remained in American hands. And because of that, German movements were still visible, still vulnerable, still targetable. Operation Luttich, the German counteroffensive, had lost its momentum. Not days later, not after reinforcements arrived, but at 2:15 that morning, the moment Sergeant Robert Callahan first heard tanks moving through the fog. The German offensive continued for 6 more days, but it never recovered the speed it needed to succeed. Speed had been everything. Speed had been the plan. Speed had been denied. The 823rd Tank Destroyer Battalion had taken it away. By August 8th, American commanders understood the scale of the German gamble. For panzer divisions, nearly 300 tanks. Their objective had been clear: cut through to Avranches, sever American supply lines, and trap General Patton's Third Army in Brittany. It was Germany's last chance to stop the Allied breakout from Normandy. But surprise alone wasn't enough. The fog had given them surprise. Callahan and the men of Company A had taken away their momentum. Hill 314 remained in American hands throughout the battle. 700 men of the 120th Infantry Regiment held that position for 6 days while completely surrounded. They survived on parachute resupply. They directed artillery fire continuously. Over 300 became casualties. But they never surrendered. From the summit of Hill 314, American observers could see everything. Every German movement. Every column. Every attempt to advance. Artillery fell wherever German armor gathered. German tanks could no longer move without being seen. By August 10th, the offensive had stalled completely. American reinforcements arrived in strength. The 2nd Armored Division. Elements of the 1st Infantry Division. Additional tank destroyer battalions equipped with mobile M10 tank destroyers. The balance had shifted. And once the weather cleared, Allied aircraft dominated the battlefield completely. Thunderbolts and Typhoons flew continuous patrols. German armor caught in the open was destroyed. Supply columns were obliterated. Daylight movement became suicide. German tank losses mounted rapidly. By August 13th, Hitler finally authorized withdrawal. The 4 panzer divisions had lost more than 120 tanks, 2/3 of their armored strength. The survivors retreated east, toward what would soon become the Falaise Pocket. The failure at Mortain had consequences far beyond the battlefield. German armored reserves had been committed to a doomed counterattack. Other sectors weakened. Allied forces advanced. Encirclement followed. By late August, German forces in Normandy were trapped. Tens of thousands captured. Hundreds of tanks destroyed. The German army in Normandy ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. And historians would later agree on one point without debate. Mortain had been the turning point. If the German counteroffensive had reached Avranches, the war in Europe might have lasted months longer. The 823rd Tank Destroyer Battalion received the Presidential Unit Citation for its actions. The citation spoke of extraordinary heroism. 11 guns lost. 37 men killed, 63 wounded, 14 German tanks destroyed by towed guns firing blind in fog, and an entire German offensive delayed at the critical moment. Sergeant Robert Callahan survived. He stayed with the 823rd through the rest of the war. In November 1944, the battalion converted to self-propelled M10 tank destroyers. They fought in the Battle of the Bulge, crossed the Rhine, advanced into Germany. The towed M5 gun, the weapon Callahan had fought with, represented a form of warfare that was already disappearing. Heavy, static, impossible to move under fire. Many officers had called them death traps. At Mortain, they proved both the weakness and the strength of that doctrine. They could not retreat, but they did not retreat. And in holding their ground, they bought the time that changed the course of the war. In the aftermath of Mortain, several members of Company A received decorations for their actions in the fog. Silver stars, bronze stars, purple hearts. The official citations spoke in measured language: extraordinary heroism, conspicuous gallantry, devotion to duty. But the documents never fully captured what had actually happened in those 4 hours before dawn. Men had remained at their guns even as German armor flanked their positions. Loaders had continued feeding heavy armor-piercing shells into smoking breeches while machine gun rounds snapped overhead. Entire crews had stayed in place until their ammunition was gone, knowing retreat was impossible. The August 1944 after-action report from the 823rd Tank Destroyer Battalion provided the clearest record. 10 pages of typed analysis. Ammunition expenditures. Equipment losses. Casualty figures. Tactical conclusions drawn with clinical precision. The report acknowledged a hard truth. Towed guns were effective only when supported. When infantry protected their flanks. When communication remained intact. When commanders understood exactly where the enemy was moving. But when isolated, the guns were vulnerable. They could not maneuver quickly. They could not retreat under fire. They could not pursue a retreating enemy. The report's primary recommendation was unmistakable: convert to self-propelled tank destroyers as soon as possible. Mortain had proven both the strengths and the fatal limitations of the weapon system. By 1945, the 3-inch M5 gun was already disappearing from frontline service. Most remaining guns were reassigned to training units or rear area defense. Some were transferred to French forces rebuilding their army. Others were dismantled and scrapped. The weapon that had stopped 4 panzer divisions faded quietly into obsolescence. But the men who served those guns never forgot what they had done. 37 of them had died at Mortain. They proved that doctrine alone did not determine outcomes. Courage did. Discipline did. Leadership did. The tactical mathematics still defied logic. 12 towed guns against 200 German tanks. No armor protection. No mobility. Fighting blind in dense fog against elite SS Panzer divisions. Every military calculation predicted destruction within the first hour. Instead, Company A held for 4. They destroyed 14 German tanks. More importantly, they delayed an entire armored offensive at the moment it mattered most. This had not been a victory of superior technology. The M5 gun was already considered obsolete. It had not been superior tactics. Firing blindly at muzzle flashes violated every principle of modern gunnery. It had not been superior numbers. What made the difference was something doctrine could never quantify. Men who refused to abandon their guns. Men who fired into darkness because doing nothing meant certain death. Men who held their ground because there was nowhere else to go. Modern military historians still study Mortain. They analyze terrain usage, defensive coordination, observation posts like Hill 314, artillery integration. But the essential lesson is simpler. Determined defenders, equipped with weapons that are merely adequate, can achieve results far beyond what mathematics predicts. Adequate mattered. The M5 gun could penetrate Panther armor. Not every time, not reliably, but enough. Sergeant Robert Callahan survived the war. He returned home to Pennsylvania in 1946. Like many veterans, he rarely spoke about what had happened in Normandy. Mortain was overshadowed by larger battles. D-Day, the Battle of the Bulge, the Rhine crossing. Mortain became a footnote, yet its consequences were enormous. The 823rd Tank Destroyer Battalion was deactivated in November 1945. Its veterans dispersed across America. Some attended reunions in the decades that followed. Each year, fewer returned. By the 1980s, most were gone. With them went the memory of what had happened in that fog. Today, a memorial stands near Mortain. It honors the 30th Infantry Division and the defenders of Hill 314. The 823rd is mentioned there, but the full story, the blind firing, the impossible odds, the 4 hours that delayed an entire German offensive, has largely faded from public memory. The Germans had called it impossible, 12 guns stopping 200 tanks. The Americans had called those guns obsolete. Death traps, not worth keeping. But on August 7, 1944, those obsolete guns, and the men behind them, proved something timeless. Sometimes, impossible simply means no one has been desperate enough to try. 37 men died doing what doctrine said could not be done. They fought enemies they could not see. They fired weapons their own army had already abandoned. They held ground they could not leave. 14 tanks destroyed. 4 hours gained. 4 hours that helped preserve the Allied breakthrough in Normandy. 4 hours that helped change the course of the war. They deserve to be remembered.